It was December 1931 at Alhambra High School in California. James Hoyal, a senior, had been cast in the school play called Skidding. It was a story of a happy family that, because of misunderstanding, was skidding into unhappiness. James' part was that of the grandfather. James wanted his family and some of his friends to come and see him in the play. He got tickets for them all, and he invited Iva Christensen. However, that night she couldn't come, so she talked her sister, Winona Christensen, into going. James went out in front to meet everybody. His grandfather, James Ellsworth Hoyal, whom James was named after, was there. James introduced Winona to his grandfather and to his folks. He then asked to be excused as it was time to go and get ready with makeup. Everybody said the cast was good. His part of grandfather was the part that changed the family from skidding into unhappiness back to happiness. During the dramatic closing scene, Grandpa states to his granddaughter, "As night follows the day, and as day follows the night, to thine own self be true, and thou canst not then be false to any man." Then Grandpa slowly walked up the stairs. After the play, there were the curtain calls, flowers, gifts, and congratulations. James left the stage and dressed to go home. The family was waiting. That's when James learned that Winona was going to have to walk home alone, so he decided to walk with her. Winona discussed the play as they walked home. She was very complimentary to James, and of course, he enjoyed that very much. But more than that, he was discovering what a beautiful personality Winona Christensen had. She loved music, and that pleased James. She wanted to be a teacher, and James was very pleased because he knew that she would be a good one. She loved the gospel and her family. She was impressed with James' grandfather and wanted to know if there was any Chinese blood in the family. James wanted to know why she asked. Something Oriental about the eyes, she said. James said he didn't know, but he would find out. After James had walked Winona home, he thought of what high ideals Winona had and how pleasant it was just to be with her. Little did James know at that time what the future held. James and Winona eventually married on Monday, August 29, 1932, in the Salt Lake Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their lives together is the story of love for each other, their family, friends, and God, and their desire to preserve and magnify that love. The blessings in their lives testify that God lives and hears and answers prayers. This is their story. The families of James Ellsworth Hoyal are descendants of German, English, Welsh, French, Scottish, Irish, and American Indian. The patriarchal line comes to America in the early 1800s from England through Thomas Franklin Hoyle and through Henry Augustine Sr. on the Rhine River in Bavaria, now Germany. Thomas Hoyle's son, John Mills Hoyle, served in the Iowa Volunteers during the Civil War. While he was serving in that war, his son, James Ellsworth Hoyle, was born on Christmas Day, 1864. James Hoyle spent time in Missouri and later Iowa. He was fond of horses and learned to ride well. In fact, he was so good that a wealthy Californian by the name of Lucky Baldwin hired him to go to California and ride horses for him at the racetrack. He worked for Lucky Baldwin for a time until he grew too big to ride. James Hoyle married Margaret Ellen Augustine. According to tradition, when James married Margaret, he changed his name to Hoyle. He did this because Margaret didn't want to be Mrs. Hoyle. James and Margaret Hoyle's second son was Lawrence Hoyle, born on May 19, 1895. Years later, Margaret Ellen became ill and died. That was on August 5, 1910. Lawrence was very lonely after his mother died.
And my father, as a young boy, had left home after his mother died and had got a job in Salt Lake City, riding the crane, putting the steel girders together when they were adding stories to the Hotel Utah in 1912. And he was very interested in the temple, and he went over one day to buy a ticket to go through, and they couldn't sell him a ticket. They explained to him about the recommend, but he couldn't understand it and said, "I guess my money's no good to you."
Late that summer, he got a job in Ogden, Utah, working on the railroad. He boarded at a place run by Mark and Mary Reed. Mary had a beautiful daughter named Lenora. Lenora was born in Tennessee and came to Utah with her parents, James Marion Owen and Mary Elizabeth Owen. They went to Utah because James had a brother named Samuel Peter Owen. Samuel Owen was a Mormon and a successful businessman.
Samuel Peter Owen and Aunt Zilphy were living there. They were members of the church, and they had a successful apple farm called the Sunnybrook Apple Farm. And Uncle Sam had invited his brother to come, and they were living there with them.
One day, while they were living in the Ogden area, James was working in Ogden Canyon for a company. A rock came down and struck James in the back. James became ill and died as a result of that accident. Lenora was an only child, and years later her mother married Mark Reed. Lenora grew up as beautiful as any of the women in the Clinton area. One day there, she met Lawrence Hoyal, who was boarding at her parents' home. Lawrence and Lenora fell in love and were married in the Ogden courthouse, December 24th, 1912. Lawrence and Lenora Hoyal continued to live in Clinton. October, a beautiful month, especially in the high mountain country. The heat of the summer is past, harvest time is about over. Already, cool nights cause the leaves to start to change their colors.
I was born on October the 14th, 1913, in Clinton, Utah. My father and mother were staying in the home of my mother's aunt, Aunt Zilphy, and Samuel Peter Owen.
James was named after his grandpa Hoyal. He was a strong, healthy baby, full of life, and received the first spank on the bottom by his great-aunt Zilpha Owen, the wife of his great-uncle Sam Owen. At about 2 or 3, when on the Owen farm, little Jimmy went down by the barn where the horses, Prince and Clody, were stabled. They paid no attention to him, so to correct the problem, he picked up a board and was about to hit one of the horses on the back of the leg. And who should spoil the fun but great-aunt Zilpha, who came running down to the barn and got there just in the nick of time. Otherwise, little Jimmy could have been the first child sent in orbit around the moon. As the horses, though gentle, would kick you like you-know-what. Great-aunt Zilpha had been busy in the house when the vision of what was taking place passed before her eyes. She dropped everything and ran to the barn in time to save Jimmy. The Lawrence Hoyal family moved to Los Angeles, California. There, he got a job working for the Southern Pacific Railroad. After Lawrence's mom had died, his father, James Hoyal, did not want to marry again. This was because James Hoyal was raised by a stepmother that didn't treat him all that well. He did not want his own children to have the same bad experience that he had. He tried to make it on his own, raising his children. While he was at work, his son Bill burned the house down. There was no public assistance in those days. Everyone was on their own. He was not a member of the church, so he had no outside help with the kids. He reluctantly put his children in an orphanage in L.A.
When I was just a small baby boy, my father lived with his father on McGarry Street, and my mother had my grandfather, my father's father, bring all of his children, my uncles and aunts, out of the home because their mother had died, and my mother helped raise them.
My mother would, when she shared the story with me, she would point out that Grandpa wasn't the oldest, and others could have helped in the family, but they didn't. But when our grandma came to Southern California, I mean, there was no question. She went to the orphanage. She got those siblings of LE, and she brought them all home, and she raised them, and she took care of them. There was no way she was going to have those kids stay in the orphanage. And that just shows the character of Lenora Owen Hoyal.
Lawrence's brothers and sisters were glad to be back home with family. They all helped and looked on their Aunt Lenora as a second mother. They lived in an area close to lots of entertainment, like the roller coaster park, the alligator farm, and the public zoo. One day, Lawrence had given Jimmy definite instructions not to ride the roller coaster in the area because they were having accidents. And it was said a small boy was seen riding on them often. He said, "I don't want to hear about you riding that thing." Well, that was it. Jimmy never rode it again. Jimmy was quite adventurous. He was caught climbing a slide in a cage of alligators at the alligator farm with an alligator moving towards him. Later at the zoo, the attendant went to feed the animals and left the gate unlocked. Little Jimmy went in. The lion was surprised, had a look of amazement and peace on his face. Jimmy was out of there in a second. Many times throughout James Ellsworth Hoyal's early life, his life was spared. Hollywood was near, and James was learning about the movies. But it was learned that if you wanted to go into show business, you had to go to a private school. That school cost too much money, so that ended the potential film career of Jimmy Hoyal. About 1921, a very new experience happened to Jimmy. Daddy Reed, his step-grandfather, came one Saturday and said that Jimmy was to go to church with him in the morning. Now this was something. Daddy Reed going to church. What would he wear? The only clothes Jimmy had ever seen him in were overalls and jumpers. Well, Jimmy was excited and surprised Sunday morning to see Daddy Reed all dressed up in a suit and a big black Texas-type hat. They went to church. It was the beginning of a glorious experience in the life of James Ellsworth Hoyal. Little Jimmy sat wide-eyed as he watched everything. When he went to the primary class, he listened with deep interest. The teacher, Sister Morgan, was so nice and sincere. When she told the story of the prophet Joseph Smith, Jimmy was thrilled and believed every word of it.
That was the first time my father had learned about Joseph Smith. He heard the Joseph Smith story, how this young boy wanted to know what he should do about joining a church, which one was right, and how he found a scripture that led him to pray in the grove of trees and receive the marvelous vision of the Father and the Son. And when my dad heard this, even as an 8-year-old boy, he knew that it was true. It touched his heart.
Jimmy had associated with a group of boys at school that were older. They were basically good boys, but they had bad habits, which Jimmy began to acquire. He started to swear a little, to act big and important, so he thought. He even tried to smoke. There were times when they planned to take things, like steal candy. After that, Jimmy could never eat a Hershey bar without a guilty conscience because it reminded him of his mistakes. Jimmy was the oldest child of Lawrence and Lenora Hoyal. Jimmy had 2 sisters and 3 brothers. They are Lawrence, who was nicknamed Laurie, Norman, who was nicknamed Uncle Sam, Norma, Mark, and eventually, years later, Lenora came along.
I remember when a couple of the brethren came from the church and wanted to talk to us about being baptized. I was 12 and my younger brother was 10, approximately somewhere in that area. Laurie's a couple of years younger than I am. They asked my father about what he thought about our joining the Mormon church and being baptized. I remember now my father could have said, well, I don't think kids ought to join any church till they're old enough to know what they're doing. He could have said that. Could have changed our lives entirely. But he had a lot of respect for the church. He said the children have been going, and if they wanted to become members of the church, he said that's up to them. But then he made this stipulation. He said if they become a member of the church, he said I want them to understand this. He said I want them to live up to its teachings. He said I want them to be good members. And he encouraged all of the family throughout our lives in that way.
Jimmy and his brother Laurie were baptized in Los Angeles, California on October 3, 1925. There was a special spirit that came to James at that time, which he always remembered. James' testimony in its infancy was growing. He was becoming more involved in the church. In school, Jimmy at first had difficulty in getting good grades. He was not the most gifted student, but over time, his confidence grew, and he was able to do really well in school. He also became well-liked and cared about his classmates. In high school, James excelled in track. He also played basketball. He made the team, did quite well. Other activities that Jimmy participated in: he played saxophone and was later the bass drummer in the high school band. He was also active in debate and drama.
I'm going back to my ancestry. My ancestry are from Denmark. We aren't sure about my father's family on one line, whether they are completely Danish or not. But as I said before and other times to other people, they were different. My grandmother and great-great-grandmother Christensen was in a different kind of a person. And we're not sure but what they might be part Jewish.
Winona's grandfather, Hans Peter Christensen, was a young man in Denmark in the 1860s. During that time, Germany, then Prussia, and Denmark were at war fighting over Schleswig-Holstein.
The Germans became a major European player at that time. They took over Schleswig-Holstein and made everyone become German and speak German, and the Danes did not like it, and great-grandpa Christensen decided he was going to show the Germans that he could speak Danish and do whatever he wanted. So he got in a bar or a restaurant, cafe, whatever they had in those days, got up on a table and started singing a bunch of Danish songs. The Germans came in and arrested him and put him in jail. And when he got out, he came home and told his family, we're leaving this country to go to America where we can be free and think and say what we want to say.
So he made up his mind that he would come to this wonderful country, America, where he could say what he wanted to. And as soon as he was able to save enough money, he brought his family over here.
In 1887, Hans Christensen and his family moved to Utah, where they joined the Mormon Church. Winona's parents on her mother's side lived in Denmark in the 1800s. After reading the Book of Mormon and joining the Mormon Church, they came to Utah in 1877. They moved to Sanpete County, Utah to raise their children. Winona's mother, Mariana Gettrup, was born July 16, 1884. She was Maud's and Mariana Gettrup's 11th and last child. She was also named after her mother. In the early 1900s, girls from immigrant families came to work in Salt Lake City as maids or cooks in the homes of the wealthy. Winona's mother, Mariana, was one of these.
And she worked next door to Governor Bamberger. And the cook for Governor Bamberger was my father's cousin. And so they got acquainted, and the cook who introduced my mother to my father, and of course they started going together, and my mother was very, very smitten with my father. He had big black eyes, and beautiful, and she thought he was the handsomest man in the world. The first time they went out together, he asked her for a goodnight kiss, and she said no. And he says, well, it's all right, it's a free country. And she thought she'd never see him again, but he came back.
Winona described her mother as being a very handsome woman, not pretty, but stately, with a sort of golden hair and green eyes. She really walked like a queen. Her eyes were large and shiny. She had a straight nose, but rather large, a king's nose, she called it, and thin lips. She was not fat, but with a large build. She was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighed 140 pounds. James Christensen and Mariana Gettrup were married on June 12, 1907. Their first daughter died shortly after birth. Their second daughter, Winona Christensen, was born August 25, 1909.
Grandma used to take me in her room, and we had whole wheat bread and put cheese on it, and then she'd cut it in little small, like half, 3/4 inch squares and feed it to me. To this day, I love bread and cheese. And she used to let me tear up papers to my heart's content. And she'd call me a tormickle, and I used to call her a spitmickle because she had either asthma or tuberculosis, probably tuberculosis, and used to spit a lot.
Winona was 5 years old when her grandma Gettrup died. The family then moved to Ogden, Utah, where her father became the superintendent of the Prudential Insurance Company's local office. While in Ogden, the family eventually bought a brand new Ford Model T, one of the first ones in the area. Winona wrote that her father was tall, dark, and handsome, and an excellent salesman. He was very strict, a typical European of that day and age. Children were to be seen and not heard, obeyed when spoken to, never to contradict their elders, and to be very polite and courteous. Her father also dressed nicely and liked to have nice things. He also enjoyed traveling to places like California and Portland, Oregon. Winona had one sister, Iva, and 3 brothers, James J., Ralph Leo, and Earl Martin Christensen.
I can remember World War I, when the Kaiser was burned in effigy on the streets of Ogden when we won the First World War.
In 1918, the flu epidemic was raging.
I can also remember when the flu epidemic was going so bad, and we sent uptown to get things. I was about 8 years old, and we used to have to wear masks so we wouldn't get the flu. We didn't get the flu in our family, but Mother was very careful. She used to make us drink hot lemonade every night. That was before the days when nobody understood anything about vitamin C. But we had that, and nobody in our family, including my father, got the flu. And my father was in and out of houses all the time with signing death certificates because of he's head of the office of the insurance company.
Winona started first grade in Ogden. Throughout her growing up years, she excelled in school and was on many honor rolls. One year, when Winona was absent, it was the only day she had missed that entire year, her teacher told the class that Winona had become the best student. Winona was always a serious-minded little girl. Everything bothered and worried her a lot. Being the oldest, Winona was given more responsibility. One day, when she was supposed to be keeping track of her little sister, Iva, she forgot. So her mother decided to teach Winona a lesson. Winona's mother hid Iva and asked Winona where she was. Winona was about 6, Iva about 4. Winona wrote later, "I went up and down the street hunting and crying. I've lost my little sister. After Mother thought I'd learned my lesson, she showed me Iva. I never forgot it again. In fact, I was an extraordinarily responsible child." The family returned to Salt Lake City. They moved a lot. James Christensen had certain ideas about houses, and if he wasn't satisfied, they would move. While living at one home, Winona and her sister Iva became friends with Estella Calderwood. Estella contracted polio as a baby and was a cripple, but she had a great deal of intelligence. Estella was always Iva and Winona's best girlfriend. She was in Iva's grade, but was closer in age to Winona. In the country towns in Utah, you didn't get along well, unless you were a Mormon. So Winona's grandfather, father, and uncles were baptized. The family was not an active church-going family. Winona said, "Dad was a good man, but never went to church. The children were outsiders as far as church was concerned." James Christensen also drank coffee and smoked. Winona babysat for her bishop, Joseph Wirthlin's children. These children were Joseph and Richard Wirthlin. One became an apostle and the other a member of the Quorum of 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Winona learned to play the piano very well. She also was involved with a girls' choir with her friend Estella. John M. Chamberlain conducted that choir. On one occasion, Winona sang with the choir for Heber J. Grant in his home. She and her sister Iva received their patriarchal blessings from the church patriarch, Hiram Smith. The blessing told her that she would be a teacher, and Iva would work with the sick. Years later, Winona did become a teacher, and Iva an RN. Winona graduated from high school and got a job working with the laundry at the Hotel Utah. Winona enjoyed her social life with her family and her friends. She attended many dances. And in 1929, she attended the University of Utah, where she got A's her first semester. But then, something happened. Winona wrote, "My dad had a breakdown. One day at the dinner table, he began shaking and crying and couldn't stop. He went to the doctor, who told him to stop smoking and recommended him to go to California because his heart was bad. He never smoked again." James Christensen and his family moved to Hollywood, California, where his company had transferred him to work. It was decided that Winona's father would pay the rent for the rest of the year on their Salt Lake home. That way Iva, who was a senior in high school, and Winona, who was still in her first year at the university, could stay and finish up. Winona's grandma, Christensen, stayed with them as well. The rest of the year was hard for Winona. She missed her family, and her grades in school started to drop. In 1930, James Christensen moved to Alhambra, California. Winona went with him to help the family get settled. Iva stayed with the family in California, but Winona, who didn't like California, went back to Utah to live. Winona stayed with her best friend, Estella, part of the time. She got a job for the telephone company and worked nights. Winona dated a lot. At first she would like the boys, and then, well, they got too interested and she would back off. Winona stated, "I made up my mind that I wasn't going to marry just anyone." After working at the phone company at night and sleeping during the day, she decided to quit. She got a job again working at the laundry in the Hotel Utah. But the depression was beginning to get really bad. Winona's boss told her, "Winona, your folks can take care of you. Some of these girls are supporting families." Winona then left and went back to California to live with her family. Her family was starting to get more involved in the church. The night that Winona arrived in Alhambra, the local Ward Mutual was having a Halloween party at her parents' house. Jimmy Hoyal was there, but Winona didn't remember him that night. But one night, Winona's sister was supposed to go with her friend Jimmy Hoyal to a play and couldn't make it. So Winona went in her place. This was the first time that Winona got acquainted with James Hoyal. James was the grandfather in the high school play Skidding. James noticed that Winona had come to the play instead of her sister, Iva. After the play, James learned that Winona was walking home alone. So James decided to walk with her, and that was when he noticed her beauty. In February of 1932, James was on the beach, thinking about his future. He remembered the nice, friendly talk that he and Winona had that night that he walked her home from the play. She had been to college. She had good ideas about college. He thought maybe she could give him ideas on his future college work. He asked her if she would like to go for a ride to the beach Saturday night. She said she would. The date was set for February 20th, 1932. They went to Long Beach to ride the roller coaster. The rest of the evening they strolled along the beach and talked. Later, they sat on a blanket and watched the waves. Winona had lots of good ideas, and her suggestions were very complimentary to James. As time went on, James thought more and more about Winona. He showed her his priesthood ordination line all the way back to the Savior. She seemed very impressed and appeared not to know James was an elder already.
Jimmy had a real strong testimony. I remember how he used to go over to church to do a lot of things, and how he was always reading things in the church and what it meant to him. When he would talk to girls before he really knew Noni, he was only for the once or twice. It was all he would talk with them, because I know that he might have asked him, "Do you have a strong testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ?" Because I know he would.
James spent time with the Christensen family, eating dinner and participating in family discussions. One night, Jimmy was visiting Winona and everyone had gone to bed. They were talking and Jimmy gently leaned over and kissed Winona on the lips. Tears filled her eyes and she said, "I'm too old for you." Jimmy didn't think so. He didn't think age had very much to do with people liking each other. He told her how she inspired him and that he wanted to be more than friends. Finally, Winona said that she had a very dear friend in Utah who she would like to talk to before she made a decision. Every few days, Jimmy would check to see if Winona had made up her mind. Winona thought that James was the best young man that she had ever met, but thought that James, being 4 years younger, was a problem. She thought that she was too old for him. Winona's father told her that she should not lead Jimmy on. He thought that Jimmy had a mother complex. James Hoyal's mother told Winona that she was older than Jim's dad and that it really didn't matter. Winona also found out that her grandma, Christensen, was older than her grandpa. Finally, the day had come. Jimmy knew the answer before he asked. Winona was cheerful and full of smiles. They sat on the porch swing as they talked. Winona told Jimmy that her friend Estella had written back and had told Winona that she didn't think that age made a difference either. So Winona said that she thought they could be more than friends. James kissed her again, and this time, Winona kissed him back. James visited the Christensen home more often now. Jimmy and Winona talked about finishing college, and maybe by 1936 or 1938, they could get married. Then in May, the Christensen family moved back to Salt Lake City. Jimmy and Winona wrote many letters. That year, Jimmy's dad bought a ranch. Originally, it was worth $35,000, but he bought it for $1,500. Remember, this was the Depression. The banks owned most of the ranches in Orosi, where this one was, and people just lived on them to keep them from being broken into. James' dad suggested that James and Winona get married and go live on the ranch and take care of it. And that is what they did.
Mom and Dad were planning on getting married by the bishop in Alhambra Ward, but the bishop called my dad in and asked him, have you ever thought about going to being married in the temple up in Salt Lake where Winona was? And so Dad said they never considered that, but he would write to Winona, see what she thought, and so he did. He wrote to Mom, and they both thought about it, and Mom wrote back and said she thought it was a great idea.
James Hoyal and Winona Christensen went to the home of Winona's stake president, Bryant S. Hinckley. They went there to get a temple recommend for Winona, but the young man who answered the door was none other than Gordon B. Hinckley, the same man who would later become an apostle and then the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. James and Winona were married on August 29, 1932, in the Salt Lake Temple for time and all eternity. They were the first in both of their families to be married in the temple. The only people in attendance were Winona's Aunt Tinny and her neighbors, the Carlsons.
And it wasn't the big fanfare you see today on wedding days where all the family members are there and everything. It wasn't that way. It was a very simple ceremony because Mom and Dad's families were not able to attend. Dad told me a story one time when we were in Salt Lake Temple. We were walking down the stairs and he stopped and he said, "This is where I put the ring on Mother's finger." He said that neither one of them knew that the ring was not part of the temple ceremony, and Dad had a ring. So after the ceremony was over and they were dismissed to go down and change, they were walking down the stairs from the sealing room in the Salt Lake Temple, and Dad stopped Mom and slipped the ring on her finger and gave her a kiss. And he told me that story while we stood in the very place where he did that. It's been a great blessing to their entire posterity that they chose to begin their lives together in the temples of our God, that they were married in the Salt Lake Temple and sealed by the priesthood power has been a wondrous blessing to all of us.
I come to the temple today with joy and peace in my soul, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. joy we share as we tarry there. All others may ever know. He speaks and the sound of his